What happens when bias blinds justice? When the power to decide someone's fate becomes entangled in assumptions rather than truth? This isn't just a courtroom story. It's a confrontation with the very beliefs we hold about others, about fairness, and about ourselves. Today, we revisit a case that began like any other, but unraveled into something no one expected. The judge sits at his bench, a towering figure of authority. His robe is crisp, his expression set in stone, his pen poised over the case file. To him, this is routine. Another name, another file, another decision to make. He doesn't linger on details, doesn't look too closely, because in his mind, he already knows what kind of person stands before him. Then there's the woman, 38 years old, poised, her every movement deliberate. She doesn't look nervous. She doesn't look afraid. She simply waits, her hands at her sides, her eyes steady on the man who now holds the power to define her day, her week, or perhaps even her future. She doesn't speak. She lets the room fill with the quiet hum of whispered assumptions. To the judge, she's just another defendant. But the truth about her is something he hasn't even begun to imagine. The gavel falls, a sharp crack cutting through the murmur of the courtroom. The sentence is swift. The judge delivers it with the authority he's practiced for years, his words echoing through the chamber. For him, it's another task completed. For her, it's a moment to reveal exactly who she is and what he failed to see. What he didn't know would change everything. This is a story about assumptions that creep into decisions, into judgments, into the very systems designed to be fair. It's about a quiet resilience, a strength that doesn't bend in the face of prejudice. And it's about a truth that left a judge, a courtroom, and an entire community rethinking what justice really means. Today, you'll witness the moment when perception shattered and justice found its voice. This is more than a case, it's a lesson we all need to hear. The courtroom held a stillness that was almost suffocating. Wooden benches stretched in neat rows, polished to a high shine but worn at the edges, bearing the marks of countless lives who had passed through. The overhead lights buzzed faintly, their harsh glare reflecting off the smooth oak of the judge's bench, casting long shadows across the room. The air felt dense, thick with an unspoken tension that hung over every person seated there, a quiet anticipation, the kind that settles when judgment is near. At the center of it all sat the judge, elevated above the rest. His robe was dark, his posture rigid, his expression carved into a stern mask that offered no clues to his thoughts. He flipped through the case file methodically, his pen tapping lightly on the edge of the bench as he read. To him, this was routine, a process repeated so many times that it no longer required much thought. Just another name on the docket, another decision to deliver, another gavel strike to mark its conclusion. But then there was her. The woman stood alone in the center of the room, flanked by rows of quiet spectators, whose eyes followed her every move. 38 years old, she carried herself with a composure that felt out of place, as though she were immune to the weight of the judgment looming over her. Her shoulders were square, her chin lifted, her gaze unwavering as she looked up at the man who now held the power to determine her fate. For many in that room, she was a mystery. Her calm demeanor defied the expectations people often projected onto someone in her position. She wasn't nervous, she wasn't pleading, and she wasn't afraid. But the whispers had already begun. The murmurs of those in the gallery who leaned toward each other, speculating about who she was, what she had done, and why she seemed so unshaken. Few would have guessed the truth about her. Fewer still would have believed it if they were told. For this woman, life had been a series of uphill battles, each one steeper than the last. She had fought for every step, pushed through moments that would have broken others, and emerged stronger on the other side. But today, wasn't just another challenge to overcome. Today, she wasn't just another defendant in the eyes of the court. She was here with a story that few in that room could even begin to imagine. And the judge? He didn't see her strength. He didn't see her story. He saw only what he wanted to see, what he assumed he already knew. And in that assumption, he made a decision that would come to define not just this moment, but everything that followed. Judge Robert Sinclair had built a reputation over his decades on the bench. Known for his tough sentencing and no-nonsense demeanor, he prided himself on upholding the law with what he believed was fairness and integrity. In his mind, he dispensed justice equally, guided by the facts and the rules of the courtroom. To those who observed him, however, his decisions often carried a different weight, a pattern that had gone unnoticed by some, but was impossible to ignore by others. His sentences were strict, unyielding even. For years, attorneys whispered about his unwillingness to consider the full context of a case. Extenuating circumstances rarely swayed him, and second chances were seldom granted. But it wasn't just his toughness that drew attention. There was something else, a quiet, persistent disparity in the way justice unfolded in his courtroom. Time and time again, statistics showed that minorities who stood before Judge Sinclair left with heavier fines, longer sentences, and fewer opportunities for leniency than their white counterparts. To the judge, this was never about race. He would have dismissed any such notion outright. His role, as he saw it, was to enforce the law, not to question it. And yet, the patterns in his decisions told a different story. There was no malice in his actions, at least none he would ever admit. But there was something deeper at play, an implicit bias woven into his understanding of guilt, responsibility, and punishment. He believed he was dispensing justice, but today, justice was about to give him a lesson of its own. As Judge Sinclair scanned the file on the case before him, he barely glanced at the woman standing across the room. Her name, her face, her story, they were nothing more than details in a long list of cases to get through. In his mind, he already understood what he needed to know: a minor infraction, a penalty to be imposed, a gavel strike to bring it to a close. He didn't see her as more than a defendant. He didn't think to ask himself why she stood so calm, so composed, so unshaken by the weight of his authority. And what he didn't know, what he hadn't even considered, would soon change everything. At first glance, she appeared as just another case file, another name on the docket, another face standing before the bench. To the judge, she was no different from the hundreds of people who passed through his courtroom each year. But what the judge didn't realize, what no one in that room yet understood, was that she was much more than what they assumed. The woman standing before him wasn't just a defendant. She was a federal prosecutor, a woman who had dedicated her career to upholding justice in a system she knew all too well could be anything but fair. Her name was Brianna Cole, 38 years old, a single mother raising her young son while navigating the demanding life of law. Educated, accomplished, and deeply resilient, she had spent years in the very trenches of the justice system, fighting not just for the law, but for the people it often left behind. Every day, she faced the weight of systemic bias, not just as a prosecutor, but as a Black woman, working within an institution that frequently viewed her as an outsider. She knew what it meant to be judged unfairly. She had seen it happen to others, and she had experienced it herself. But Brianna didn't let it break her. She carried herself with strength, grace, and the unshakable belief that change was possible. She had learned to navigate a world that underestimated her, a world that too often assumed she didn't belong. And today, standing in this courtroom, she wasn't here to beg for leniency or explain herself to someone who had already made up his mind. She was here to let the truth speak for itself. Composure was intentional, every inch of it honed through years of experience. She had stood in courtrooms just like this one, had argued cases before judges just like him. But this time, the tables were turned. The judge didn't know her. He didn't know her story. And as she stood before him, calm and resolute, Brianna Cole knew that it wouldn't take long for him to realize exactly who she was and just how much he had gotten wrong. The judge's eyes scanned the case file in front of him, his expression neutral, but his assumptions quietly shaping the way he viewed the woman standing before him. In his mind, she was a typical defendant, caught for a minor infraction, likely with an excuse at the ready. Nothing about her suggested anything out of the ordinary. To him, she was just one more case to process, one more name to file away and forget. He glanced up briefly, his gaze flickering over her before returning to the paperwork. Her calm demeanor struck him as unusual. She wasn't fidgeting or apologizing, didn't look defensive or distraught. Instead, she stood silently, composed, meeting his eyes with quiet strength. It was a demeanor he misread as either arrogance or detachment. He shifted in his seat, his voice sharp as he addressed her for the first time. Skull, he began, his tone already carrying an air of condescension. It's one thing to make a mistake. It's another to act as though it doesn't matter. Responsibility is key. And it seems to me that you might need a reminder of that. The words hung in the air, an unnecessary lecture, giving without understanding who he was speaking to. But Brianna didn't react. She let the words pass over her, her expression unchanging. Her silence only seemed to confirm his assumptions. The tension in the room was palpable, though no one dared to speak. Subtle microaggressions peppered his remarks, questions about her character disguised as professional inquiries. "What exactly do you do for work?" he asked, his tone implying skepticism. Without waiting for a reply, he continued. Employment goes a long way toward avoiding situations like this. His words carried the quiet sting of presumption, as though he had already decided she must be underemployed or struggling to get by. Brianna remained calm, her composure never faltering. She knew better than to challenge him outright. Not yet. As the case continued, his tone grew firmer, his assumptions more evident. He asked her if she understood the consequences of her actions, framing his questions as though she lacked awareness or accountability. To him, she was simply another person who had made a poor choice, another defendant needing a lesson in discipline. He was building his argument, deepening his biases, without realizing how far off the mark he was. And through it all, Brianna stood steady, listening, letting him reveal more about his perception of her than anything she had done. By the time he finished, the room was silent. The judge had said his piece, delivered his reprimand, and was prepared to move on. But what he didn't know, what he hadn't even considered, was the truth that Brianna Cole was about to reveal, a truth that would challenge every assumption he had made. The judge leaned back in his chair, the decision seemingly simple and straightforward. His pen scratched against the paper, the sentence finalized in a few efficient strokes. A steep fine. To is filed for his patience, and to his mind, necessary. To him, it wasn't just about punishing a minor infraction. This was about teaching a lesson, about accountability. It was his duty, he believed, to correct behavior, to set an example. And with that, he struck the gavel, the sharp sound echoing through the room, final and unyielding. The fine was disproportionate, more than what others in her position might have received, but no one in the room dared to say it out loud. It was just another judgment in a long day of cases, one that would have gone unnoticed if not for what happened next. The murmurs started slowly. A few spectators in the gallery leaned toward each other, their voices barely above a whisper, as though trying to piece together what they had just witnessed. The fine was unusually high for an infraction so minor, the punishment harsh for what seemed to be a simple misunderstanding. Even the court clerk glanced briefly at the judge, then down at the case file, her expression betraying a flicker of unease. But if Brianna Cole felt the weight of the sentence, she didn't show it. She stood motionless, her shoulders square, her face unreadable. There was no outburst, no plea for reconsideration, no sign of emotion. She simply waited, her silence filling the room in a way that words never could. It was the kind of silence that demanded attention, that made people shift uncomfortably in their seats. The judge, oblivious to the undercurrent of tension, continued as though the case was closed. To him, this was just another file to clear, another gavel strike in a long career. But as he moved on to the next case, he couldn't help but glance up again at the woman still standing before him. There was something about her, something in her stillness, that he couldn't quite place. He cleared his throat, his voice carrying a slight edge, as he addressed her again. "Ms. Cole," he said, the authority in his tone meant to dismiss any lingering challenge. "I hope this serves as a reminder of the importance of accountability." His words hung in the air, pointed and final. And yet Brianna didn't respond. She didn't argue. She didn't move. Her silence was not one of defeat, but of calculation. Around her, the murmurs grew louder, the spectators sensing that something was about to shift. The tension in the room became almost tangible, a weight pressing down on everyone present. What the judge didn't know, what he couldn't have imagined, was that his assumptions, his decision, his entire perception of the woman standing before him were about to be shattered. In his mind, he had taught her a lesson, but he had no idea who he was talking to. And what was about to happen would leave everyone in that courtroom questioning what justice truly meant. The room was still as the judge leaned forward, his gavel resting beside him, his expression marked by a faint impatience. He believed the case was closed, the sentence handed down. To him, there was nothing more to be said. But then, from the center of the courtroom, the woman's voice broke the silence, steady, calm, and unshaken. "Your Honor," she began, her tone measured, her words deliberate. The judge looked up, his brow furrowing slightly. He hadn't expected her to speak. "Before I leave, there is something you should know." Her voice carried across the room, not loud, but commanding enough that even the quiet whispers in the gallery ceased. All eyes were on her now, the tension thickening with every second. She adjusted her stance, her gaze unwavering as she addressed the bench. "My name is Brianna Cole," she said, her voice steady, yet with a quiet authority that caught everyone off guard. "I am a federal prosecutor for the United States government. I specialize in civil rights cases." The words landed like a thunderclap, though she spoke them without raising her voice. For a moment, it was as if the entire room held its breath. The murmurs in the gallery vanished, replaced by a stunned, almost oppressive silence. Even the judge, seated above her, seemed momentarily frozen. His pen slipped from his hand, falling soundlessly onto the desk. His face betrayed a flicker of confusion, then shock, as the full weight of her statement began to sink in. It was a silence that stretched on, heavy and unbroken. The judge's expression shifted, his stern demeanor giving way to something far less certain. His gaze fixed on Brianna, but this time it wasn't the dismissive glance he had given her earlier. This time he saw her. He saw her not as a name in a file, not as a defendant, but as someone who had just shattered every assumption he had made about her. For the first time, the authority of the bench seemed diminished, the power of the gavel overshadowed by the quiet strength of the woman standing before it. The silence lingered, every second adding to the weight of the moment, until the judge finally blinked, his mouth opening as if to speak, but no words came. In that instant, the dynamics of the courtroom had shifted entirely, and everyone in the room could feel it. The room seemed to hold its breath, the silence stretching impossibly long. And then, like a spark igniting dry kindling, the gasps began. Soft at first, sharp intakes of air from those seated closest to the front, before rippling outward into the gallery. Whispers followed, low and urgent, a chorus of disbelief that grew steadily louder as the weight of Brianna's words spread through the room. "Did she say federal prosecutor?" one voice murmured. "Civil rights cases?" another echoed. Heads turned toward each other, eyes wide with shock. Even the courtroom clerk, who had been focused on her notes, paused mid-scribble to glance up, her pen frozen in place. The quiet authority in Brianna's voice had shattered the atmosphere of control the judge once held over the room. Now, all attention was on her. The camera pans to the judge, his discomfort palpable. He shifted in his seat, his once stern posture now tense and uncertain. His hand moved to adjust his glasses, though they didn't need adjusting. He fumbled for his pen, grasping it briefly before setting it back down. His lips parted, as though searching for words, but none came. For the first time that day, or perhaps in many years, Judge Robert Sinclair looked entirely unprepared. The murmurs grew louder, filling the space with a buzz of incredulity. People leaned toward one another, whispering in hurried tones, trying to piece together what they had just heard. The courtroom, a space built on routine and predictability, was now electric with something new, the undeniable realization that assumptions had been made, and they had been wrong. And at the center of it all stood Brianna Cole, calm and composed, unshaken by the reaction around her. She didn't look at the judge with defiance or anger. She simply stood, her presence commanding the room without needing to raise her voice or say another word. She had already said enough. Brianna Cole stood at the center of the courtroom, her calm presence now commanding the attention of everyone in the room. Her voice, steady and deliberate, cut through the silence like a blade, her words carrying the weight of a lifetime of experiences. She spoke with conviction, not loud, but impossible to ignore, and the room seemed to lean in, drawn to every word. "Every day, I see people like me judged, not for what they've done, but for what they look like," she said, her tone unwavering. "Today it happened to me." Her words struck a nerve, their honesty reverberating through the room. She spoke not with anger, but with a quiet strength that demanded to be heard, addressing the realities of systemic bias and the lives of so many others. She described her work as a federal prosecutor specializing in civil rights, her career dedicated to seeking justice in a system she knew all too well was flawed. She spoke of the patterns she had witnessed, the assumptions, the disparities, the countless faces who had stood in courtrooms just like this one, judged for reasons that had nothing to do with the law. Her words painted a picture of the quiet injustices that often went unseen, unacknowledged, but were felt deeply by those who lived them. The courtroom remained still, the weight of her words pressing down on every person in the room. The judge sat frozen, his expression shifting from discomfort to something resembling reflection. Her message was unmistakable. Justice, true justice, could not exist in the shadow of bias. And for the first time that day, the power in the room shifted. Not through defiance or anger, but through the undeniable force of her truth. Judge Robert Sinclair sat in silence, the weight of Brianna Cole's words pressing heavily on his chest. Her calm, yet powerful statements echoed in his mind, louder than the murmurs of the courtroom around him. For the first time, he was forced to confront a truth he had ignored for years, a truth that had always been there, hidden beneath the guise of impartiality and routine. As her words settled, his thoughts began to wander, unbidden, to moments from his past. Cases flashed in his mind like snapshots. A young black man sentenced harshly for a minor theft, his pleas for understanding dismissed as excuses. A single mother fined more than she could afford, her story of financial hardship waved away as irrelevant. A teenager whose nervous demeanor in the courtroom had been interpreted as disrespect rather than fear. These weren't just isolated memories, they were patterns he hadn't allowed himself to see, each scene replayed in vivid detail. His gavel striking down on lives he didn't fully understand, his assumptions about character, responsibility, and guilt coloring decisions he had told himself were rooted in fairness. He had seen their faces that now seemed to blur together, faces he hadn't truly looked at. And now, sitting in the aftermath of Breonna Cole's speech, he realized how many of those faces had belonged to people of color, to people like her. In his mind, he had always been the arbiter of justice, dispensing the law without bias or prejudice. But Breonna's words had stripped away that illusion, revealing cracks in the foundation of the role he had prided himself on. For years, he had dismissed the whispers, the statistics, the quiet criticisms of his rulings as the misunderstandings of people who didn't know the law. But now, he couldn't deny the uncomfortable truth. Justice in his courtroom hadn't always been blind. For the first time, Judge Sinclair was forced to confront a truth he had ignored for years. He realized that justice, the very thing he had dedicated his life to, required more than authority, more than the stroke of a pen or the sound of a gavel. It required humility, understanding, and the willingness to look beyond assumptions. And in that moment, he wasn't just a judge. He was a man reckoning with the weight of his own choices, and the realization that the person standing before him wasn't the one who needed a lesson in accountability. He was. As the room settled into silence, Breonna Cole's words lingered in the air, like a weight no one could escape. She stood with the same quiet strength she had carried throughout the hearing, her final statement delivered with grace and precision. I hope this serves as a reminder that justice isn't about power, it's about fairness. Her words struck deep, resonating far beyond the confines of the courtroom. They weren't delivered as an accusation or a plea, but as a simple truth, a truth that left no room for argument or denial. The spectators, the court clerks, and even the attorneys in the room shifted uncomfortably, as if they too had been drawn into the judge's reckoning. Now, Judge Sinclair's hands rested heavily on the desk before him, his eyes fixed on the file he had so easily dismissed earlier. His mind raced, replaying the moments that had brought them here. He glanced up at Breonna, the woman he had misjudged so thoroughly, and for the first time, his expression softened, not with pity, but with understanding. He opened his mouth to speak, hesitated, then began again, his voice lower, more deliberate. Cole, he said, his tone stripped of the authority it had carried just moments ago, I may have approached this case with assumptions I had no right to make. The admission was quiet, but in a room so still, it carried the weight of a gavel strike. It was an acknowledgement of his mistake, though incomplete, words that were necessary but could never undo the judgment he had passed. The resolution felt bittersweet. On one hand, Breonna had succeeded in exposing the blind spots of the man who sat in judgment over her, but on the other, the reality of the system she had spoken about. The biases, the disparities, remained firmly in place. The judge's words were a start, a small step toward accountability, but they were not enough to erase the years of decisions made under the influence of unchecked assumptions. Brianna Cole nodded politely, acknowledging his attempt to reconcile what had just unfolded. But as she gathered her things and prepared to leave the courtroom, the message she had delivered remained suspended in the air. Justice isn't about power. It's about fairness. And on this day, fairness had finally found its voice. Brianna Cole's case was just one moment in a single courtroom, but it spoke to a much larger truth, a truth that plays out in courtrooms across the nation every day. Studies have shown that systemic bias in the justice system isn't just a theory. It's a reality backed by numbers and stories too painful to ignore. Statistics reveal stark disparities in sentencing. Black defendants are 20% more likely to receive custodial sentences than their white counterparts for the same offenses. In drug cases, the numbers are even more troubling, with Black Americans facing sentences that are, on average, nearly 20% longer. The disparities don't end there. Bail amounts, probation terms, even decisions about guilt or innocence, all are impacted by implicit bias, shaping lives before facts are ever fully considered. But the numbers only tell part of the story. Behind every statistic is a person, a family, a community, bearing the weight of these disparities. There's the story of a young father sentenced harshly for a nonviolent offense, his pleas for understanding dismissed by a judge who assumed the worst, or the mother fined more than she could afford for a minor infraction, the punishment leading to a cycle of debt she couldn't escape. These stories aren't isolated, they're part of a larger pattern that has eroded trust in the very system designed to protect and serve. Experts on racial injustice and implicit bias have long warned about how these disparities manifest. Dr. Elaine Porter, a leading sociologist, explains, bias isn't always overt or intentional, it's the quiet assumptions we carry about someone's character, their background, their intentions. In courtrooms, those assumptions have the power to define someone's future. These biases often go unnoticed by those who enforce the law, but for those on the receiving end, they're impossible to ignore. Legal scholar Michael Reyes adds, the problem isn't just individual judges or prosecutors. It's the structure of the system itself, a system built on the illusion of impartiality, but riddled with the same societal prejudices we see elsewhere. To address this, we need more than awareness. We need systemic change. Brianna Cole's story isn't just about one judge's misstep or one woman's resilience. It's about a justice system that has for too long operated with blind spots, ones that disproportionately impact marginalized communities. It's about the need to confront these biases, not just in individual moments of reckoning, but in the very fabric of how justice is delivered. Brianna Cole didn't let her experience in the courtroom end with the judge's quiet admission of fault. For her, that moment was a spark, a catalyst for a broader mission. She knew her case wasn't unique, and the systemic issues it exposed weren't isolated to a single courtroom or a single judge. She left that day more determined than ever to address the inequities that had shaped not only her experience, but the lives of countless others. In the months following the trial, Brianna became a vocal advocate for reform within the justice system. She worked tirelessly to shine a light on the biases that often go unnoticed, speaking at legal conferences, participating in panels, and consulting with organizations dedicated to justice reform. Her work wasn't about blame, but about solutions. Training programs for judges and prosecutors to recognize implicit bias, policy recommendations to address sentencing disparities, and initiatives to increase transparency in courtroom proceedings. Her efforts gained national attention, earning her a platform to push for meaningful change. She was invited to testify before congressional committees, her words inspiring lawmakers to consider new legislation aimed at promoting fairness in sentencing and judicial accountability. In interviews, she spoke not only as a federal prosecutor, but as a Black woman who had experienced firsthand the impact of systemic bias. Her ability to blend her personal story with her professional insights resonated deeply, making her a powerful voice in the fight for justice. Brianna's professional accomplishments only bolstered her mission. As a federal prosecutor, she continued to handle civil rights cases with the same meticulous care and dedication she had always shown. But now, her work carried an added weight, a deeper commitment to ensuring that those who entered her courtroom were seen for who they truly were, not who they were presumed to be. She became a mentor to young attorneys, emphasizing the importance of empathy and fairness in every case they handled. For Brianna, this incident was more than a personal experience. It was a call to action, a moment that solidified her belief in the need for systemic change. Her message was clear. Justice is not just about laws or rulings. It's about fairness, accountability, and the courage to confront bias wherever it exists. And while the road ahead was long, Brianna Cole had already taken the first steps, proving that one voice, when used with conviction and purpose, can begin to reshape even the most entrenched systems. This isn't just a story about a judge and a prosecutor. It's a reminder of the power of truth, the strength of resilience, and the importance of challenging the assumptions we carry every day. It's a story that asks us to question not just the systems we rely on, but our own role in upholding justice and fairness. Brianna Cole's experience in that courtroom wasn't an isolated event. It was part of a larger narrative, a reflection of the struggles faced by so many who have been judged unfairly, underestimated, or overlooked. But what makes this story remarkable isn't just what happened, it's what came after. Brianna's unwavering determination to turn that moment into a movement, to push for a system that doesn't just punish, but understands, doesn't just judge, but listens, is the true lesson here. In the years that followed, Brianna became more than a prosecutor. She became a mentor, a leader, and a voice for those who often go unheard. She worked tirelessly to shape a legal system that sees people not through the lens of bias, but with the clarity of fairness. Her presence in courtrooms, classrooms, and communities stood as a testament to what can happen when one person chooses to confront injustice rather than accept it. Her story reminds us that justice isn't just about laws or verdicts. It's about people. It's about the courage to stand tall in the face of prejudice and the resolve to fight for equality, no matter how long the road may be. Brianna Cole's journey is proof that change is possible, but it starts with each of us, with the questions we ask, the assumptions we challenge, and the choices we make. Brianna Cole's story isn't just about her, it's about all of us. It's a reminder that bias can shape lives in ways we don't always see. But it's also a call to action. Have you ever faced bias? Have you witnessed moments where assumptions shaped decisions or outcomes? Share your story in the comments below. Let's create a space where these conversations can lead to understanding and change. If this story moved you, if it made you think, or if it reminded you of someone who might need to hear it, don't let it stop here. Share this video with others, because change starts with awareness, and awareness grows when we listen, reflect, and take action together. Thank you for watching. Let's keep the conversation going.